Good afternoon, everyone. It's Doris Branker, Doris Thecoder with DB Healthcare Consulting and Education. I realized when I started my channel, I said it would be something that would include reimbursement and coding and certification tips and auditing. So this is really keeping the promise as far as the auditing is concerned. Now, whether you are looking to be an AAPC certified auditor, that's the CPMA, that credential, or whether you are going for something like the CHC, the Certified in Healthcare Compliance, or any of those credentials that include auditing in the scope of it. I don't know, I've never seen a book on how to audit and what to look at, but I've learned some tips in auditing for so long throughout my career that I'm going to share with you today. So I just completed an audit of 106 records, a blind audit of 106 records that was related to the public healthcare emergency that's COVID-19. So if you were following this, with COVID, a lot of practices that never did services such as telehealth, just because they didn't kind of qualify for them, started doing telehealth. And then some codes that were never paid started to be paid, like phone visits, right, which Medicare didn't consider before, and started to, reconsidered. And then telehealth using AV and what that looked like. So the purpose of this audit was to find out, with all the constant changes going on, whether we kind of lost something in translation based on the payer guidance, how we reported services, what our services documented versus what were actually reported. So this is one that I did for a client. So tip number one, and it's going to give you 5 tips. This video is going to be 5 tips for properly performing an audit, right? So tip number one is you want to set a goal, right? So what's your goal? What's your target? What are you looking for? I kind of explained that earlier when I talked about why I did this audit. So my whole point was, are we correctly coding the types of service? I do E&M audits and level of care audits all the time. This was not that, and this is the hardest thing for me as an auditor, because once I find an issue, I want to dig and dig and dig and dig and find out how deep the rabbit hole goes. I have reconciled with myself that when I do an audit, it may lead to another audit, so I need to stay focused on the target at hand when I'm doing an audit. So this particular audit actually spanned, and I will have to do another audit to see whether or not we've got a place of service denial issue, because a payer gave us one instruction, we billed according to that instruction, and they're not kind of paying according to that. So I need to do a dig to find out how big that issue is, so it can be a reimbursement thing that I can get my client reimbursed for the services if that payer consistently denied it. So that's tip one. Tip number one is set a target goal. What are you looking, a mission if you would? What are you looking to accomplish by performing this audit, right? When you figure out what you're looking for in performing this audit, you set up your audit sheet. Now I hid some of the columns here just for PHI reasons. Even though I didn't have a great deal of PHI, I don't complete like medical record numbers and all of that in that, but just to be super safe, no one wants a HIPAA or high-tech violation, so I removed that. So I wanted to know what CPT code was reported. When I set up my sheet, I set that up. Of course, I did the data service provider and those other things that I hid. But what CPTs were reported, what CPT was documented, what the findings were, and additional findings. Who the payer was, that becomes very important, make sure that was valid, and then my free text field, which was my common field. Now my client is on eClinicalWorks. ECW uses a system called HELO. HELO allows you to satisfy the AV requirement that the telehealth codes require to bill. So for example, one of the things they told us that in order to bill an E&M, a regular like office visit, you had to have two-way real-time audio-visual communication. So HELO is capable of that. They can connect with the patient with like a Facebook Skype type function that's HIPAA compliant through their electronic medical record system. So I wanted to know if HELO was used. So I added that. That was something that I added later. I had to go back into it because I thought about it and said, okay, if we're audited, how do I prove it? Right? Because I've been in audits, okay, one thing's documented, but how can I prove it? So if they say, well, yeah, but prove it to us, how do I know? HELO has a tracking within it, so I added that and expanded that later on the audit. I also found that telephone codes, so I'm going to have my assistant go in and kind of finish that part. The telephone codes, the 99441 and the G codes, required talked about an appointment within a week. So why is this patient seen? If they're being seen for something related to what's in a week, then you don't kind of get to bill that visit. So if you saw them a week and that's why you're doing the phone visit, or you did a phone visit and you're going to see them within a week, or that kind of soonest visit, then I got to kind of track and understand that. So I'll have to dig a little bit deeper into that. So I've done that. I've set up my audit sheet. When it comes to findings, and this is kind of at the end of it, but I do a pivot table, for example, right, to just show me high-level view what my findings look like. That helps me develop my report. Findings, additional findings, there are things that you want to set fixed phrases or drop downs in your sheet. For example, Blue Cross and Blue Shield is someone in my client mix. They could see, I could say Blue Cross Blue Shield like you see on the screen. I could say BCBS. I could say BCCO, Blue Cross Community Options, or BCBS HMO, Blue HMO, Blue Care, Blue Advantage. I could use all of those to relate to Blue Cross and Blue Shield. And that would give me a different entry when I'm looking to analyze my data. So when it deals with payers and findings and additional findings, when you plan your sheet, you want to anticipate the kind of issues you're looking out for and the kind of issues that may come up. And you can always expand your list if you need to, but once you find like, hey, I'm seeing a few of these, then I would expand my list. But the idea behind creating a drop down or a fixed list is because, and I'll demonstrate this for you later, when you're using a system like Excel or Access or any kind of analytics program, a computer is not a person. So it can't make sense out of something that's clearly very straightforward to you as a human brain that can analyze data. So saying something two different ways, BCBS, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Blue Advantage, Medicare, BCBS, like anything like that, saying it in those different ways and phrasing them in those different ways creates different values in a system of doing analytics. So when I deal with findings, additional findings, anything that I'm going to run a report off of, I want to make sure that is a fixed column. My comments field is a free text column. My Hilo use, because that's a yes, no, or the time, free text column. So you can put whatever you want in that. You just want to make the data neat. There is a really excellent function within Excel that is Alt-E, right? So if I'm typing something, let's say I'm just going to type something in this cell, and I'm going to type a list of animals, right? So I'm going to say cat, right? Cat. And I want to also say dog, right? I don't want it on the same line, but I want it in the same cell. I can do Alt-E, and next line say dog. Alt-E again, and say parrot. And all of these are in the same cell. That's very helpful when you're doing a comments field. It is not so helpful if it's a field you're reporting off of, and I'll show you why. I'll show you why kind of in a minute, right? So I did that in this particular cell, right? Coding error, it was insufficient documentation for one reason, and then there was missing information as far as the signature was concerned from one of the providers. So that was two errors that I had here. When you run a report or use some of the analytical functions in Excel, it's going to look at this like one thing, right? So even though Alt-E is really good for something like comments, just because it's a little neater, and like I said, cat, dog, parrot, right? I want to see those kind of separate. It is not a good idea to use that in a field that you're intending to report off of. So when necessary, what I ended up doing is I initially had findings, my first finding, my initial primary findings, and then additional findings is what I added to it, because when they were wrapped together, it created too many entries on my sheet to analyze. This was not a super large audit. This was 106 records, but I've done audits that are sometimes like hundreds of records, and any additional entry just becomes, this is why auditing, to do it properly, really does take a little more time. So that's step 2. So set up your goal, set up whatever the goal or target is once you have that. Once you have the goal or target, you start your goals, you set up your audit sheet, create your fixed phrases for findings. Fixed phrases could be payers, right? If I don't want 1 million entries of county care, I could put that together. I could put county care, I could put well care together, or well and care, right? However I do that. Abbreviate it, create that as a fixed list. So instead of someone having to type it, they have to use a drop down. And you can do drop down lists in Excel very, very easily. I'm not an Excel master. I think I love the program because I learn more about it every day, but I also seek to learn a lot about it. So if I want, for example, this range, right, to have a certain field, then I'll create a list, right? So let's say I say this list is going to be my list of pets. So it's going to be a cat, it's going to be a dog, and it's going to be a parrot, and things I hate. I'll even add a snake, right? Right? So this is my list, and there's probably a much more sophisticated way to do this. So I'm going to select what my range is, and I can select the whole column, but I'll have a bunch of blanks. I don't want that. I'm going to select, and I'll just put a couple extra in there in case I want to add something later. And this is already alphabetic order, and I select those, and notice how this D1 comes up. I'm going to call this pets, right? So now, if in my audit sheet, I only want this to have the pets that I want in that field, I don't want people adding other pets, I'm going to title my field, select my column, go up here to data on my Excel sheet, and then I'm going to go to data validation, right? And let it know, as far as column N is concerned, what I want to be acceptable in column N, right? So any value is what it defaults to, but I don't want it to have any value. I want it to have a list. And because I created the list and I titled the list, right, I'm going to put equals pets because that's what I call the list. Instead of doing that, if I do equals and it's in a range of cells, I could actually go to that cell range and select where it is. But because I called it pets, I'm going to do that. Now, then I want input messages, right? So if for example, I'm going to jump to error alert. What if someone put something in this field other than what I put in the list? So let's say someone puts in a turtle. Well, I didn't put a turtle, right? I put cat, dog, parrot, and snake, right? So I can tell it what I'm going to allow. So I could say, no, stop them. Like, I don't want anything but this, right? And when I stop them, I can also put a mirror. You know, please choose from selected list or add or request additional pet, right? And I may say the error, I want the error to come up as an invalid option chosen, right? And I want it to stop them, right? I can put an input message in case I want them to put certain things here, right? So I might say, choose the pet from list. I don't know, I'm making this up as I go, right? Pet options. And that's what I'm going to title it, right? So what I just did here is I said, okay, as far as column N is concerned, I want the only thing there is something that I put in the list from the source pets, and then it's highlighting what that list is if I click that, right? The input message, I'm going to say pet options, choose a pet from the list, and if they enter a pet from a list that's not on the list, I'm going to say stop them. I can also say warn them or give them information, but I want to stop them. Don't let them go any further, meaning you don't have an option but to choose what I picked. Tell them it's an invalid option chosen and tell them what to do. So I'm going to click OK here. So when I click in this, it says choose option from the list. So I get an instruction, and notice cat, dog, parrot, and snake only come up. But you know what? I found in my audit that a turtle was applicable, right? And that didn't work because it should not have allowed that. Oop, I must have changed something. Let's check my data. So I'm going to go to data, data validation. Yeah, my error alert is on stop. So what is it doing here? Oh, you know what? I think I've got to fix my, so let's do this. Okay, right? It did that because I selected extra fields, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to select extra fields. It didn't like that. But it would have worked if I'd called pets just those 3 animals I named. And that error comes up. It says invalid option chosen. Please choose from selected list or request additional pet, right? You can try, retry, it's going to let you re-enter something else. But if I, was to put in, again, anything else besides what's in that list, it's going to yell at me the same. So that's very important when you're in Excel, that you control your sheet, especially when you're working around among multiple auditors where people might say things differently. Even I say things differently. After I'm like 50 records in, I may forget what I called it 50 records ago and create a whole other entry, which will, come back and kick me in the face a little bit later when I'm doing the audit. So I'm going to delete this because all of this is really not related to my audit. So your tip is, once you get your goal, set up your audit sheet, make fixed phrases. Now you've audited all of your data and you're done. You want a quality check, right? So you want to understand what the findings mean when you use the findings. If I'm setting an audit and I'm dealing with other people, where sometimes I have a large audit and I may involve other people in it, I set rules for the audit, right? So, okay, we're going to use this if we find this. This is what this finding means. So inside the sheet, this was an audit I did by myself, but if I had other people involved, I would let them know, use missing information for anything that should be in the chart that isn't there, right? Use coding error for anything that's specifically related to the code, right? Use type of service error if the kind of code used is invalid, right? So in this one, I found this provider had used a lot of office visit codes for telephone encounters, right? So I have to set parameters for how we're going to operate through this audit when I pull other people in, because we've got to be looking at the same thing and doing it the same way in order for the data to make sense for us. So after that's set up, I'm going to quality check my data. So I'm going to go through things and say, okay, let me make sure this makes sense, right? So maybe I'll pull in some of my codes, and I'm going to scroll over here for a minute. Oh, I'm all the way over. I forget I hit that, right? So reported came from the practice. I'm never going to shift that. I'm going to look at documented CPTs, and let me say, okay, let me just look at the ones that are truly office visits, right? Because if it's office visits by the rule, it's actually a true office visit. So I looked at a period of April, like a quarter, from like April to June or July, I think. If it's truly an office visit, they would have used HELO, because that's the AV Medicare requires, or the patient was actually in the office. So I want to see all the ones that my documented CPTs fell within the office visit range. And I should see for HELO use, I should absolutely see time there if it's not in the office, right? And if it is not, there's nothing under HELO or some equivalent system, they weren't using Skype or anything, then I have a note that says in-office visit. This is where my findings are important, right? So if I say, okay, there's not HELO, but it's an in-office visit, then it's an office visit, right? So I will go through and eyeball and quality check my findings to make sure they make sense, they don't conflict with anything there. And I check each one of my findings, right? Note, reads telephone evaluation and through HELO. So, okay, good. I also put my metric in there. Right, so far, and I've already done this part, I look at my data, this makes sense. All of the office visit codes are there. And because when you do so many records, you may type something wrong. You're human, right? So maybe you put the wrong finding. Like I found one of my findings I put incorrectly. I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. Why does it say phone, but I said the office visit code is right? So was the code I entered wrong, or was my finding wrong? So I had to go back to my chart. And now I'm going to say, well, let me look at the ones that I know are telephone visits and see what data I have there. So again, I shouldn't have any yeses in HELO, because HELO says, and that's good, right? HELO says that real-time AV communication was used. So all of my HELO should be no. If I see a yes, I have a problem. This is the QCing part of your data that you want to do. And this is where Excel and filters are super helpful, because you can look at those things that make sense. So when I look at this, and I say, okay, HELO's used, I populated, let me just search the comments field and make sure I don't see anything with HELO in it, because again, HELO is that system my client uses with ECW. Wait, that's a HELO. Oh, that's okay. They were unable to connect to HELO. This is also a HELO. Oh yeah, unable to connect to HELO. This says HELO, unable to connect to HELO. So again, as I go through this, I am feeling good about how I completed this audit here. 15 minutes, yep, no login, HELO. So this is great, right? So that makes sense so far. I've kind of quality checked my data. I had another thing where when the system for the report that had patient in, and I have no patients in here now, so that's good. But said patient, I realized that it was looking at the position that the status that the claim was in. So if it had already been billed to insurance and allocated to patient responsibility, it said patient, even though that wasn't the payer. We had another payer in the system, so I had to go through and actually update that as well. So, okay, I'm done with my audit. I have all my data. So this looks pretty good. But, so when I run a pivot table here, I see a lot of stuff that looks redundant, and I'm going to make this as large as I can for you. See how big I can get that. Okay, so as I see here, coding error level of care and coding error level of care, I'm sorry, type of service, well, I have two of them. So level of care and level of care look the same. Type of service look the same. So it's pulling different entries. So I can't immediately at a glance see how those are different. They really look quite alike to me, but I know they have to be, because if they weren't, Excel would not have looked at it that way. Remember I said controlling your findings help. So correctly coded and correctly reported mean the same thing. But again, maybe when I started the audit, I was saying correctly reported, and then as I got into it, I went correctly coded, right? Those three, this one, and this one all mean the same thing. So what I'm going to do now is further my step 3, compress my data further, because I don't want to have to do analytics and add those things up unnecessarily. So I'm going to fix that. Now remember I told you about the Alt-E function. So this says correctly coded missing signature and it's all together. Even though nothing looks like that, on my sheet, I used Alt-E, so it kind of lined it up really pretty for me, just like I did for the cat, dog, parrot in that single cell. When you go to output and report on it, it doesn't look that way, right? So that's why I added the second column for additional findings, so that was just a little more visual for me, and I didn't have to go through a bunch of analytics. So I'm going to go back to my sheet now, and when I turn on my findings, make this nice and big, right? So correctly coded missing, first of all, I want to fix that one. So I'm going to unselect all of those, and I'm going to do this correctly coded missing signature one, right? And it's not a lot of it, but again, because I wrapped it in a cell, that's why it looks that way. It visually looks better because I use the Alt plus E enter function, but I'm going to just filter these over, and I'm going to remove this part. And then I'm going to remove the bottom part over here. And because these are all the same findings, these are the same thing, I'm just going to fill that data down. Okay. Now when I go back to my audit sheet, and I'm going to refresh this data now, this one's going to disappear. Correctly coded missing signature is going to disappear and just fall into one of the correctly coded, right? So those three jumped into this area. Now, remember I told you how Excel is very picky? Correctly coded and correctly coded literally are reading the same thing, but because I used a capital C here and I used a lowercase c here, it's looking at that as two different entries. So now I'm going to, again, further compress my sheet. I'm going to go to my audit sheet, look at my findings here, deselect all, and I'm going to look at all the ones that say correctly reported. I'm just going to look at all of them together. Correctly reported and correctly coded, because I know that means the same thing, it's just my brain did something different and put that different. So I'm going to put those together. Now all of these say correctly coded or correctly reported. I'm just going to clean that up. I'm going to make them all correctly coded. I liked it when I used the capital, so I'm going to do a filter all the way down there. And And again, this is a smaller audit comparatively with when you do auditing, you might get like a 1,000 record audit or a 500 record audit, and that could take you quite some time. But this is why it's very important, because imagine having 500 records and splitting that between 5 different people and how they may track it or document it differently. Without those fixed parameters, you could have a nightmare in cleanup. It should not take you that long. Right? So now that I've done correctly coded, and correctly reported, I'm going to see correctly coded. These should all go to 17, so this should go to about 20. So again, I'm going to refresh this and see correctly coded is 20 now, right? So a lot easier. So again, I'm going to do that same cleanup. I still can't visually see what the difference between coding level of care, coding error level of care, and coding error level of care LOC is. So again, I'm going to go back to my audit sheet and further compress my data. And I'm going to pause just so this doesn't be a really long video with me compressing my data. But wait, before I do, I'm going to show you what this looks like. So notice I have 2 entries for level of care, 2 entries for type of service. I am going to correct that so it isn't 2 entries anymore. So when I come back, you're going to see that that is compressed and I'll only have 1 of those entries. Okay, so I have cleaned up, got it. So I've cleaned up my level of care issue here. And when I refresh now, I have 1 for level of care, 1 for type of service, 1 for correctly coded. So let me actually refresh. I've not refreshed my data yet. See how that just compressed. So level of care is 1, type of service is 1, correctly coded, not reportable, insufficient information, bundled service, overreported. That's generally my findings, right? So I set up my audit sheet, I quality check my data, I compress further, and then it gets to me compiling my report, right? My report should really be a summary, right? So what was the goal? What did I do? Right? How did I approach it? What do my findings mean? And the final part is to use numbers and percentages. One thing that frustrates me about E&M coding is the difference between like an expanded problem focus history and a detailed, right? When you say limited or extensive, that could mean different things for different people. So when I do my auditing report, I make sure I am specific. I looked at 106 records. I'm going to say 57 of them had type of service issues, meaning 57 of them we coded 1 type of service and it supported another type of service, right? So, and what I found in that audit is the provider was reporting office visit codes when they should have used telephone codes. And again, some payers were or weren't paying for telephone codes or later decided they would after they first said they wouldn't. So all of that was kind of stay on top of that. So I'm going to have exacts, right? So 57 records. 57 of the 106 records, or I'll say, you know, almost 50% of the records, because I know that's kind of close to there, right? So when you are auditing, remember those 5 tips to really save yourself. Of course, you also should spell check. So part of quality checking your data should be spell checking, right? So if I know it would probably yell at things like Hilo, and I run into this a lot, there's not a good spell checker that I'm aware of. If you know of, please like notify me, leave it in the comment box of a spell checker that helps with medical terms, because oftentimes, like I didn't really use many medical terms in this report. Oftentimes when you add medical terms into it, it's just totally different. It calls them all spelling errors when they aren't. And I even see here I'm missing a comment here, so I'm going to go back to my system and find out why I have nothing here. I put missing signature, but it should have missing signature type of service, and I have no notes here. So I've got a part of my quality checking and reviewing my data. Everything should have a finding, especially unless it's correctly coded. If it's correctly coded and it's authenticated and everything's fine, then I'm not going to have a finding. My finding says what it is. I don't need additional commentary, right? That's just wasteful on my sheet. But if it has any kind of error, I've got to explain what the error is beyond saying what the error is, right? So if I say it's a level of care error, I'm going to say the code reported was 99214, but the documentation supports 99213. If I'm going to say it's type of service, you know, you build a phone visit or you build a office visit and should have built a phone visit. Missing information, etc. So that's why I said it was hard for me to kind of I had to force myself to stay on track with this audit because I found other issues that I had to just note down and say, okay, that may need a separate audit. It's not the focus of this audit, and I've got to complete within a certain time, but it is something that will need to be looked at a little bit later. So I hope you found this video helpful. Just to recap, to help you after you set your goal for your audit, what your target goal is, your mission is, and what you're looking to accomplish. Set up your audit sheet, control it as much as possible. Of course, have free text fields because you want that data, and that data will help you when you start to compile the report, identify the specific kind of issues you saw in that category. Quality check your data, use filters, make sure it makes sense to you. Make any corrections as necessary. As you use a pivot table, that's what this thing was right here that I used, that lets you see your data at a high level. Compress further if you need to. Compile your report, and when you compile your report, be specific with numbers and percentages so you can let your client know how deep the rabbit hole goes. Again, this is Doris Franker with DB Healthcare Consulting, also known as Doris Thecoder. I hope you find this video helpful. Until then, happy auditing, coding, compliance, and all the things that goes with it. Thanks.